everyone! So I want to start out my discussion by saying, as Perlexi said in his interview, he used some very big words because as kids read and giggle through his book, they are learning new words and thus growing their vocabulary. While I was reading Silverstein's book, Where the Sidewalk Ends, I would flag several poems that I thought could be expanded on in the classroom. In either poetic form or even just different subjects, such as the poem Smart, which talks about how a kid is so smart and outsmarting everybody, and his dad gives him money, and then he goes and he trades it for 2 quarters because 2 is more than 1. And I think that you could expand on that in the math sense, and you could teach them the value of money and how that even though, yes, 2 is bigger than 1, 2 quarters is not worth more than $1. I think another one that was really great in this poem was this one here, where he wrote a poem as the neck of a giraffe, and I think kids could take that and they could write their own poem and put it in a shape of the animal that it's about. And I think that that's just such a great expanding their understanding of poetry. Silverstein and Perlexi definitely provides these avenues and just so many more through just a funny way. I mean, I was laughing while I read them. So other than the first poetry book that I read this week was Can I Touch Your Hair? It's by Irene Latham and Charles Waters. This book was published just last year in 2018, and the subject of these poems are all about, if you look here, they're poems about race, mistakes, and friendship. And the form of poetry in this is mainly free verse, as it goes unrhymed. At first I was a little confused by it because most of the poems that I read are rhymed. I really liked this collection of poems because it presents all of these poems as a project. As you read through it, they have 2 point of views, the girl and the boy, talking about the same thing, and how because they grew up in different families, they're going through different things. And a lot of these things tackle important things that kids go through, like punishment. Here's a point of view from how this kid gets punished and how this kid gets punished. Charles gets punished by having to wait for his dad to come home. That's what his mom said. While Irene tells a story about how Mom pulls the paddle from the top of the fridge and hands it to Papa while I hid behind the door. Later, when I snatched a French fry from off of Papa's plate, that fire still blazes in his eyes. And it just shows that so many different things, and I just loved these poems. As far as disliking any of them, I didn't really dislike any of them, and I think that these poems really appeal to children, as I said, because they tell stories that most kids go through, such as family dinner, project with classmates, they may or may not like, and many other things. So the next book that I read this week was probably my favorite, which was I'm Just No Good at Rhyming, and Other Nonsense for Mischievous Kids and Immature Grown-Ups. And I have to tell you the truth, the immature grown-ups definitely got my attention. This is by Chris Harris. This collection was published in 2017, and this is a collection full of nonsense poems that seem to be absolutely ridiculous. And the forms of these poems in this collection there's a variety of forms, such as narrative poems, lyric poems, and concrete poems. I really like how in between all the nonsense that there was still some poems that reached out to serious events in children's lives. Such as I'm Shy on the Outside, which is a great poem about this kid that's shy on the outside, but on the inside, but deep down inside, I'm so extroverted. I'm the life of the party here under my sin, so keep knocking. Someday I might let you in. And that, I feel like, just speaks to me about so many kids, how when you slowly get to know them, they're just so much more out there and everything because they're now comfortable with you. And But I really liked how some of the poems had to do with the whole book, or he had a running poems like The Snail That Saved San Francisco, or the poem 8, which was really interesting because he had a poem about a kid that didn't learn 8, and if you pay attention, the number 8 is never in there. It goes 1, it goes 7, 9. 8 is never in there, and I just love how that's a running gag. This is a pretty easy to determine what children would find appealing in this book from such silliness, but also real life situations, and the shortness of most of the poems makes it a quick and easy read, and the illustrations and weird, strange vocabulary. I just really loved this book. And then the next book I read this week was Where the Sidewalk Ends by Shel Silverstein, and this book was published in 1974. It's full of humorous poems about so many different things. Like the previous collection, this book relies on many different forms, such as narrative poems and lyrics. And I really liked several of the poems inside this book, such as Fish, which says, "The little fish eats the tiny fish, the big fish eats the little fish, so only the big fish gets fat. Do you know any folks like that?" And I think that you could expand on this as talking about the food chain and how it works, and you could do it in science. And I just saw so many poems, if you see here, that could be expanded on in the classroom. And of course, there were a few poems I didn't like, probably because of either over silliness or just not really understanding it. I think that, like the other collections, this poetry appeals to children because of their short language, its vivid and hysterical vocabulary, and so much more within just this collection. And I have definitely found a new love for children's poetry and just poetry in general through this. And the last book that I read this week was The New Kid on the Block by Jack Prelutsky, and this book was published in 1984. As the other ones, it's also full of hysterical poems that intrigue the young minds of children. Again, like the others, it had many informed like narrative and lyric poems, and one of the poems that stood out to me in this book was Louder Than a Clap of Thunder. And if I can find it. And that's basically about a kid's snoring, and a kid's dad snoring, and how I feel like, and it goes, it's louder than a clap of thunder, it's louder than all of these things. And I think that is a really great way of talking about metaphors and how they're supposed to be used. And and students could also continue to find comparisons to loud snoring, because I'm sure that someone in their house snores as well. Again, there are several poems that I didn't really like, I guess, but that honestly just stems down to my taste of poems. And just like the other ones, while reading these poems, I could definitely see how children could get so easily enthralled in such literature and spend hours upon hours reading these different poetries. And I think that this type of poetry appeals to young readers because of its shortness and its humor, but also this book relates to children in a way that most poems do not. Looking at things from their point of view and showing exactly how a child would feel, like homework. Like, most adults would not write something about homework being awful, because then kids think it's awful. But honestly, I related to this poem because of just how much in college the overwhelming weight of homework is just so much that I'd rather be doing anything else, like taking a bath with a shark. One thing that I would like to add is just by reading this book, I'm just no good about rhyming. One of the kids that I'm nannying, as I was reading through it, I just kept thinking about him and how much he might like it. So I decided to show it to him, and so I gave it to him, and he just sat there for probably like an hour. He didn't read the whole thing, but he just like scrolled through it, and he would just read something, and then he would go and he would laugh, and he just loved going through it. And I just And I even saw there was a couple words he didn't know, and I would have to assist him with it. And I was like, there, his vocabulary is growing. He now knows how to say that word. And he just fell in love with the silliness of all these poems. And I just loved it. Bye.